Always takes a minute. Hello, hello, hello. We are live. We won't start straight away. I'll give people kind of 30 seconds to a minute. We are obviously recording it and we'll go on YouTube. So we won't hang around for too long like we would normally do. But this should be very interesting. It is something where I don't know that much about. I've not been in that situation yet. And so, yeah, it's going to be very interesting. I'm hoping that Becky can give us as much information as possible and provide tons of information around this topic, because I think it's something that does affect many people, and potentially, and at that point, will massively impact people's well-being. So it's vitally important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Before we get started, I will say this could potentially get quite sensitive in areas. So if you do feel like you need to step away, please do. We understand. Obviously, this will be very touching and hard for sort of topic to talk about. If you have any comments, please do ask questions. Please do say bits. Please get involved because it helps me. Helps me ask questions. Helps Becky answer questions as well. But yeah, looking forward to it. So to stop me rambling along, I will quickly introduce myself because I know there's some people here from your network, Becky. And I'm going to get me out of the way, and then it's all about you. So yeah, I'm Richard Turner. I'm the founder and director of Employees Health. Employees Health is a workplace wellbeing company which helps businesses support their well-being at work, as well as helping educate employees in how they can live happier, healthier, higher performing lifestyles. And that's kind of it. We do it in a few different ways, but if you want to know more about that, so you just send me a message and we can have a chat. That's the boring bit done. Becky, it's lovely to meet you. I'm very excited. We met already, but it's lovely to have you on. Sorry. I look forward to chatting a bit more about it. But can you introduce yourself and your story?
Yeah. So my name's Becky Kearns. I'm one of 3 female co-founders of Fertility Matters at Work. Fertility Matters at Work is a social enterprise, or a community interest company, and we see a world where anyone who is struggling to bring home a baby doesn't have to struggle in the workplace. And this is something that's been brought about as a passion from all 3 of us. We've all got our own personal experience of struggling to conceive. My own story started when I was working in a HR role. I was 28 and I was diagnosed with early menopause, which came as a huge shock at the time. And I'd always wanted to be a mum and was thinking that might happen in the near future, but suddenly to be told that that might not ever happen was a real life altering moment for me. And we were told that we needed to go through IVF because essentially my eggs were running out. And so we embarked straight on the pathway of IVF. We went through 5 cycles with my eggs. I did get pregnant on the first cycle, but I sadly miscarried at 8 weeks. And I think that was the point where it really hit me that this might not ever happen. But during that time, I was working, I was in a professional HR role, I had a client base. And I look back and I think actually the most difficult part, or one of the most difficult parts of that time, was how I was managing that with work. And that's kind of where it all comes together. But just to give an ending to my story, we eventually went down the path of egg donation. And that's where I then had my 3 girls now. So I've got a 6-year-old and 5-year-old twins. And I then started talking about my story because nobody was. And I realized how alone I felt at the time. I started a blog called DefiningMum, and an Instagram account and community, and very much spoke around the decision to use an egg donor and becoming a mum in a very different way to what I imagined. So we talk about defining mum as redefining what it meant to be a mum. And that's what led me then to start becoming a patient advocate. So I talked a lot about going through IVF and the emotional experience. I then joined up with Natalie and Claire, who are the other two co-founders, and we realised that we needed to do something about this conversation in the workplace. So a week before lockdown in the pandemic, we sat in a pub in the Peak District, and we had so many post-it notes out around what we wanted to change and how we were going to do this. And that's where it all really began. We did our first set of research in 2020. And then in 2021, we launched our training services, and we've been working with lots of different employers since around education, awareness raising, getting policies in place, and really getting this topic talked about. And it's been such a hot topic as well in the press. I think there's a real kind of desire for people to start opening up this conversation. And I think on the back of what's happened with the whole menopause conversation in the workplace, I feel like fertility is the next one that really, really needs breaking down, opening up, and we need to do something about.
Yeah, 100% agree with you. Anything that can affect somebody's well-being needs to be spoken about, needs to be not a stigma. We need to be able to have those conversations and help people through that. It's just a part of being a nice human being, and being a nice human being should be at work as well, right? I have a question on what you were saying there. Initially was within your HR role before all of this, before Fertility Matters, and you were having these struggles. Was you a consultant or was you an employee?
So I was an employee. I was a HR manager.
Okay.
And I had my own, I was working for a corporate organization, and I had my own client group that I looked after. So very much an employee. And I must say, and Claire who's my co-founder, also works in HR. And between us, we've both got over 35 years experience, but neither one of us had ever had anybody come to us in our HR capacity to have somebody who said, I'm going through fertility treatment, I need support. And so when I was going through that myself, I thought I was the only one. I thought it was really rare. And I didn't realize that we know now from the World Health Organization, 1 in 6 people globally are impacted by this. And it was only when I started opening up in the workplace that I found other people who had been through it. And then I would be the one that would take people for a coffee at the point when they said that they were going through this. So I think what it really highlighted was that there was a real lack of conversation. There's a silence around the issue, really. And what we find is that organizations aren't talking about this topic in particular, or really recognizing it, because they probably don't even realize that it's a problem. We say it's hidden in plain sight, but because they're not talking about it, their employees don't feel comfortable to come to them and say, I need help and support. And it is one of those topics that disclosure and people sharing that they need support is a real problem. And what we need to do is try and help facilitate that and help them feel, we would say, psychologically safe to be able to do so.
Yeah, 100%. So my follow-on question was this. So when you was going through that challenge, and obviously nobody else had spoken out to you about it, how did your workplace deal with that? How did your workplace manage to support you?
So I was really fortunate. Yeah, I was fortunate because I had a workplace that was flexible with me and allowed me that time to go for appointments. I was actually, when I was diagnosed and told I needed to go through IVF, I was in my notice period in another job, and I was literally just starting this new job. So yeah, I see your face and you think, oh, okay, so I've just been in an interview. I've been telling them all about my career ambitions and everything I want to do, which were all true and still relevant. But then I was having to go and say to them that effectively I was actively trying for a baby. And let's face it, who goes and tells their employer that? Nobody, if unless you need support. And it was the most terrifying conversation I've ever had to have, to sit down with my manager as I was starting a new role, saying, actually, in a few weeks' time, I'm going to need some flexibility because I've got these appointments. And I was really grateful that she was supportive, and I was able to do that. But I really felt like they weren't able to see the true me in the workplace, because I was very, very conscious that, because I was having these appointments, and usually they're first thing in the morning, you go to the fertility clinic, and there's not a fertility clinic on every corner, so there can be a commute. For me, it was an hour each way to get there. You'd have an internal scan, then you'd have a blood test, then you'd go into work. And I would always try and be that very first person at the clinic so I could be seen first
Mm-hmm.
and then I could get into the office. But I'd be walking into the office and it would only be about 9:15. And this is obviously pre-pandemic and the kind of the
There
flexible
was an
working that
office.
happens now. But I felt really guilty. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, and I did work from home a little bit, but that was the exception. It wasn't the norm at the time. And so I became very conscious about what people might think of me and might they think that I'm not as committed to my job, um, and all of these different things that were going around in my head. And I would say that because my journey was a long one, so we obviously went through multiple rounds of IVF, and I struggled particularly after the miscarriage and needed some time after that. I actually took annual leave for it, which I look back now and I think, why did I take annual leave to grieve? But that was me at the time trying to make sure I wasn't impacting the business too much. And I did feel that maybe the support waned after a while because I think there's a common misconception that IVF works and it guarantees a baby. And I went into it thinking, this is the answer, this is going to work. And then gradually, after each failed cycle, there was more grief and that realization that maybe this wasn't going to happen. And so I actually got to a point where I remember considering leaving my job because I felt like I couldn't do both. I didn't feel like I was doing either well. I was failing with the IVF and I felt like I wasn't giving my best um, at work. And I remember having that conversation saying I think I need a career break. And I was really grateful, but actually they said, well, we want to keep you. We could move you into a role that is sort of outside of the development pipeline, but you can do 4 days a week. And so my career was impacted in some way because I had to take that move, but that allowed me to do both and allowed me to stay at work. And we know from the research that we do at Fertility Matters at Work that retention is a really big issue here when we talk about people in the workplace, and that 36% of people will consider leaving their jobs. And we hear from people all the time who they just don't feel supported or it's become too much and they have left. And then you think about the cost of that to a business as well.
Yeah. I think there's a kind of obviously a few points you've made. I think there's a couple I'm going to pull up on. The first one was like you felt like you were doing your job well, and I think this really like ties in. And then you were worried about that, sorry, and then this really ties into actually people's desires to do their jobs well. People want to work because they enjoy it, but then when you're trying to manage the both, I think that becomes really stressful. But within this kind of situation, that stress and that worry and that anxiety and all of the things going on mentally and emotionally doesn't help you in the challenge of also, I don't know the correct terminology, but having and keeping the baby when you have that situation because you are so stressed and worried and anxious. But also that stress you get from telling someone you're trying to have a child, and I can imagine that's also a stressful element as well. And so none of this is very good for perceiving a baby, or that's my correct terminology. Yeah, having a baby. So I mean, obviously, I feel like you maybe had quite a good, considering what 7-8 years ago, 9 years ago, potentially you had quite a good relationship with your business to be able to go through that. But I can imagine there's probably not the same for a lot of people. And we will explore that a little bit later on. But before we kind of move on, I know you mentioned in your introduction that there's more news and there's more information going out around this topic at the moment. And I know you last week were on BBC because of some latest research. And you were sharing some more information, some stories from there. So can you give us a bit more information about that?
Yeah. So this is, I mean, we can't believe actually the amount of uptake there has been within the media about this topic. And just going back a little bit, last year we were fortunate to be invited on to BBC Woman's Hour. So this is where I really started to talk about this topic, and they had a huge response. And actually, on the back of that, we had an MP, Nikki Aiken, who got in contact to say, I'm really interested in this. And she had a constituent who had been through a really difficult experience in her workplace, and she'd effectively left the business and signed an NDA. And we then got working on the Fertility Treatment Employment Rights Bill, and that's something that has been happening over the past year. And through that, there's been a lot more coverage of this issue, a lot more people coming forward and sharing their stories, and more research as well. So we've run our own polls, and we've got a huge community on Instagram that we engage with who are actively going through treatment at the moment. So we get some real insights as to the difficult experiences. And I think you're right. I think I'm one of the lucky ones in the sense that my experience, although it wasn't the best it could have been, it was supportive, and allowed me to stay at work. Um, what we're hearing is that many people are being discriminated against, they're not being treated in the right way. And actually, the recent study by Pregnant Then Screwed, was a study that I was asked to go and comment on BBC Breakfast last week. They found that only 42% of people had actually told their employer they were going through treatment, and it's less than half of people, when we think of 1 in 6. And I think some of the reasons for that is the things we've just spoken about, that whole fear of what will people think of me. But there's also that lack of legal protection. There is no statutory right to be able to take these time off for these appointments. And so that was something I was talking about, but also the experiences that were sent in, the stories that were shared with the BBC were people who had taken time off for a miscarriage, for example, and they'd taken time off afterwards, they were grieving, and then had been put through formal absence procedures as a result, when actually should be protected under pregnancy legislation. But all these people who are going through these really, really traumatic experiences, and sometimes I don't think it's because organizations are not being understand. I think they just don't understand what it means to go through this. And that's why we're really keen on sharing stories and what it feels like, and talking about that impact, not just from that physical perspective, but from that real emotional well-being perspective as well. And also there's a financial element as well, which then impacts well-being as well, because not all treatment is funded on the NHS. So there's so many different angles to this.
Mm.
And they were at the BBC. I remember the producer said to me beforehand, "Oh, we're going to open up the text lines. I don't know whether we'll get much of a response to this." And I said, "Well, you will. You'll be inundated." And they were. And they said we'd had such a huge, overwhelming response of people sharing their experiences that they want to do more on it. So it's starting. It's the start of change. I feel like change is coming. But I still can't believe that we're only at this point now, when IVF has been around for kind of 40 years now.
Yeah,
It's crazy.
yeah, it is crazy, isn't it? But it's nice to hear. It's nice to hear that. So I've been distracted. So what happens when you get people commenting, being distracted by the comment. But it's nice to hear that the awareness is now happening, although it might be late. But it is finally happening. The conversation is happening. This is why I wanted to get you on here, with my little following I have, to kind of share and help businesses, HR people know what they can do to support their people even better. Let me just get a second to read this. IVF. Yeah, I can imagine being self-employed makes this easier
Yeah,
in some respects, but then also, yeah, as you said, harder.
definitely.
Yeah, follow Fabienne. Fabienne, I'm going to say that is. Follow Becky. She's always going to give tons of useful tips, and that's obviously something which we probably don't talk about that much as well, is doing this as a self-employed individual as well, and how hard that must be. You have the freedom and autonomy, but then there's that no worry about work coming in and working and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Um,
I think as a self-employed person now, I would appreciate the flexibility and not having to have those conversations, but also you've got that financial strain, and when you're not working, you're not earning. It's very, very difficult. So yeah, all the best to you as you embark on that. There are lots of resources on our website about this topic, and we're always talking about this through our social media as well. So hopefully you'll know you're not on your own as you're going through this. Yeah, and no HR department to ask for help, which again, and actually what we find is a lot of HR departments don't have that knowledge to equip them to support as well. And I know if somebody would have come to me to say, I'm going through IVF, can I have some time off, or I need time off, what am I entitled to? I'd have really struggled to offer them anything other than the practicalities of like speaking to their manager and agreeing some flexibility. But what we realize is actually it's that emotional support as well that's really important, and signposting to where they might be able to get more support externally as well. So yeah, I think there's a lot of work to do in terms of just getting that word out there within HR departments as well. And I mean, we see some policies. I mean, there's a real lack of policies in place. I think that's one of the big issues that we have. Um, if you think about you're an employee, you're in the workplace, and you find out that you need to go through fertility treatment, you most likely will, your first port of call will be, is there a policy that I can find to find out what I'm entitled to? And what we're finding is people, there's either no policy in place, or it might be just a single line within another policy, and sometimes within the maternity policy, which can be really triggering for somebody if they're trying to become a parent and they have to go through the maternity policy to find out what they're entitled to. But one of the worst things we see is that it's actually grouped alongside elective procedures such as cosmetic surgery, Invisalign, and that is where people suddenly think, I can't tell my employer this, because they don't understand that they think I'm doing this as out of a lifestyle choice as
Yeah.
opposed to circumstance. And that's one of the big misconceptions, I think, when it comes to fertility treatment, that people do it because they've chosen to have a child and they want to do it in this way. And these,
Yeah.
you see things in the press about Paris Hilton going to have IVF because she wants to have twins, and all of these different things that aren't reality. Nobody would necessarily choose to go through fertility treatment. It's very much by circumstance, and it can be the only route for some people to have a baby. And I think also really important to mention, it's not just obviously women are predominantly impacted due to the nature of treatment, but where there's a partner, there may be a male partner involved. That male fertility makes up half of the reasons for people needing fertility treatment. And we think of same-sex couples as well, who to build a family will need to have some help. And so it's a real people issue. It's not just a women's issue as well.
100%. Because I remember when we met, I met you at the This Can Happen, and there was obviously Sean on there. I think it was Sean.
Yes,
Yeah,
Sean.
and he was
Yeah.
sharing his story about it. And kind of obviously being another man, kind of begins to sink home a little bit more. And it doesn't, it's not just women who struggle with. So obviously, as you said, potentially 50%. Is it 50? Do you know the statistics on that between male and female?
Yeah, so it's generally 50-50. So split in terms of half, and it's very much often seen as a female issue. But actually, like as Sean showed through his story, it can have just as much of an impact. And Sean's story is very impactful because actually there's not many men talking about this, even less so. I mean, it's even more hidden um, within the male perspective, also within other cultural communities as well. So the South Asian community, the Black community, there's additional stigma around talking about these particular topics. And so there's so much work to be done to not just open up this conversation, but to make sure that it's inclusive and representative of everybody.
Yeah, 100%. And what shock men don't want to talk about something, and it's something else where we need to try and help and break down that stigma about. Actually, this is just something it's going to be good for you to talk about as well. It's going to help you manage it, and you'll get the support you need.
Yeah.
Bit off topic, but I think I'm loving it. I'm loving the different routes we've taken. We'll get you back on my list of questions. And so I think you kind of mentioned one of this already about around policies. But let's explore the different challenges you also see within the workplace. What are the biggest challenges that people face when it comes to fertility? Maybe apart from the policy side, because you've kind of gone into that a little bit already.
Yeah, so I think I've touched on this already, but it is that psychologically safe space, and it's around the culture, really. It's about how do you get people to feel confident that they can talk about this. And we have people saying to us, actually, there is a policy in place, but I don't feel comfortable to use it because of my particular manager or who I'm dealing with. And so as important as having you can put a policy in place and not do anything else with it, and still people might not feel comfortable to come forward. It's about having that awareness raising, but also that educational piece as well. And I think having worked in HR, I know how much managers have on their plate. It can be huge, and you can't expect a manager to know everything about every life event and different situation. But what you can do is provide that level of awareness. And what we do at Fertility Matters at Work is we support organisations in not only putting in place employee support pathways, so the different touch points that they might come across, but manager support pathways as well. So it's having that guidance for managers on maybe things what not to say as well, because often what we find when people are talking about the fact that they're struggling to bring home a baby and going through fertility treatment is there's a lot of misconceptions, but there's a lot of comments made that can be well-meaning but quite insensitive as well. So if I was to give some examples, one would be, oh, well, you can always just adopt. That isn't helpful for anybody going through this. There's no just about adoption. Adoption is a whole new path to parenthood. And I was just speaking to a man earlier on today who's going to be on a panel for me next week, and he was sharing his experience of adoption and all the different processes and panels and the mental health toll that that takes, and then transitioning a new child. So these throwaway comments almost diminish what somebody's going through and don't validate that experience. So, like, oh, just relax and it will happen. Or I know someone who went through IVF, they did X, Y, Z, then they went on holiday and bam, they just got pregnant. Again, that story isn't going to help somebody. We also hear comments such as at least you. So one particular comment I received was somebody talking to me about another colleague who had cancer, and told me how positive they'd been at work and how they'd stayed at work throughout. And it finished with, it puts it all into perspective, doesn't it? At least you're not ill. And in that moment, I didn't know what to say, because I was kind of thinking, well, yeah, of course I'm grateful for my health, but I'm actually going through a really difficult experience in terms of that loss of my imagined future, and will I ever be a mum, and all of these other questions. So I think people often like to say something to try and put a positive spin on a situation or to make people feel better, when actually sometimes the best thing to do is just to say, I'm here for you, and I
I'm
know
sorry.
it's really shit, I'm sorry, what can I do? And to let them lead. And so not to try and fill that with advice. I think that's a really important thing as well for managers, but also for colleagues in the team as well. And how can you support somebody going through this? Well, you can be really mindful of what you're saying, mindful of those intrusive questions, such as when you're having kids or when you're having any more. And you can be aware of your own impact that you can have on someone. So can you maybe, while they're at an appointment that morning, can you cover for them? Can you help them pick up a little bit of workload during this temporary period? There's lots of things that people can do on a daily basis, and it is just about that awareness. And what we tend to do within organizations, and I talk about this lack of conversation and creating this psychologically safe space, is that we host panel discussions where we come, we talk about give an overview of the topic, we give some tips as to how to support, but we ask people from within that organization who are comfortable to come and share their stories. And they are so powerful. And often we get a really, really good turnout. And actually, people on the back of it then either come away going, I feel like I've learned something new, or people who've been through it feel that they're validated and this has resonated. And it's a little bit like a domino effect, because then you get other people coming out. And that's where you start to see your internal peer to peer support networks form. So there's a real process that we work through with organizations. It's not just about putting a piece of paper and a policy and saying, there you go, you're done, tick, let's move on. You've got to make that cultural change, which is part of that awareness, that education, and
The hardest
that
part, right?
whole cultural shift.
And it's
Yeah.
not easy. It's something which we talk about the whole time, and it's got to come from the whole business, and everybody has to buy into it. And unfortunately, people don't. And so more stumbling blocks, and getting those senior leaders to buy in, I think obviously is going to be so important for that cultural piece around this topic as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there anything else you wanted to add in regards to the kind of different challenges that companies might face and people might face as well?
I think if just to kind of give that overview of kind of that impact and then the impact it has on the organization, if it was to think about obviously the physical side of going through treatment, If you think about an individual, we've got a brilliant diagram that shows an IVF cycle and all the touch points. One of the real difficulties and challenges is the unpredictability and the inability to plan around these sorts of appointments. So it very often depends on how your body reacts to medication. It very much depends on the start of your period, for example, as to when you can start your IVF cycle. So a real challenge can be going to your employer, going to your manager saying, I'm going to need time off this day, I'm going to be late in this day, because you often don't know until 24 hours notice. And the clinic might phone in an afternoon and say, you need to come back tomorrow for another scan because your blood results aren't quite right. And so that can be a real, when you think about physically being present at work and managing that workload. So flexibility is really important for people to be able to manage this. But what we would say from a business perspective is you might be sat there thinking, I can't afford to have people going for these appointments, and how am I going to plan it around the team? What we know from our research is that for those going through treatment, almost 70% will take time off sick. And generally that's because they're hiding it. And so if you think about sickness absence, which might be days at a time, that's unplanned, you can't anticipate, versus a conversation where you can talk about their needs, a little bit of flexibility, might be the odd hour here or there where they're needing to come in a bit later or work things around, then not only are you supporting that individual, you're also keeping them in the workplace. So people who need fertility treatment and have that desire for a family aren't going to not do treatment because you're not going to support them. They will do it one way or the other. And so having that support will really help from that perspective. But what it will also do is keep them engaged. And we've spoken about that stat around people leaving. You think about the retention as well and the cost of having to hire somebody else and train them. And actually, these people aren't going through treatment because they're not committed to their job. It's just the circumstance that brings them to it. So it's maybe thinking of it more in terms of it is a medical treatment, not just something they're choosing to do. And I think it's that real mindset shift for organizations. So that's what I'd say from the physical perspective. I'd say from the emotional and well-being perspective, as we know, 90% of people going through fertility treatment will experience anxiety or depression. So we know that's a huge number. I think one of the stats I shared at the This Can Happen conference was that 42% will have suicidal thoughts at some point. So it really shows the extent and the depth of feeling around this topic. And we always describe fertility loss as that grief. It's hidden, it's intangible, it's about the things that haven't happened as opposed to memories about a loved one that you may have. And so it's really hard for people to articulate, but having that recognition in the workplace, and that might be through having those peer-to-peer support networks, it might be through having signposts to psychological support or the charity Fertility Network UK. It also might be through your EAP or your employee assistance program. How can you make sure that there's tailored counselling support through that? I did actually access counselling when I was going through my experience through my EAP, and that was a huge help because it gave me that space to almost talk about how I was balancing work with this and what this meant. And again, that helped keep me at work. So there's lots of things that employees can do to support the physical, the emotional, and then just finally, just touching again on the financial impact. If you think about when somebody's going through treatment, if they're not getting funding from the NHS, and it really very much depends on where you live in the UK. There's a real postcode lottery to whether or not you get that funding. Then just think how important that job and stability is to you. Especially if you're trying for a baby as well and you're thinking about upcoming maternity leave. And so we hear from a lot of people that they don't want to lose their jobs. They want to be able to do what they can. And that's where it becomes very, very difficult. They fear that if they tell their employer that they're going through this, are they risking their job?
Yeah.
Or even that next promotion? And that's the other thing we've heard of people who have then been passed up for promotions that they've been lined up for because their boss knows that they're actively trying for a baby, and it's discrimination. But the problem is there's no protection out there for people at this point in time.
Yeah, it is tough, isn't it?
Yeah, it's huge, isn't it, when you start thinking about it?
And this is the thing I found when I was listening to this happen. Actually, I didn't realize you're just probably quite oblivious to it, to the impacts and how companies can and do this well and bad. People know my background. I've never worked in a business, and so especially from a HR standpoint, especially from like a strategy standpoint, it's all very kind of new to me consistently when I learn these bits and pieces. So you just kind of go, why would somebody do it like that? And so it's very weird how companies can kind of run, especially when it does come from an empathetic standpoint. So yeah, it does always kind of catch me off guard as such. Some things companies do. I wanted just to kind of call back a second or two. You spoke about the emotional side of things, and this might not be an area you can support with, but you said that 42% of people suffer depression when they're going through this, or suicidal thoughts.
Suicidal thoughts is 42%, 90% suffer from depression or anxiety. Yeah.
Because obviously, this is kind of thing that I like to try and understand and see how people can support during this period. Is apart from the policies, apart from the support what workplaces can do, what can an individual do to actually reduce that number, to actually make sure they don't go down that rabbit hole of poor mental health, and actually stay more positive? How do people personally stay optimistic, stay positive, stay happy?
So I think it's really important to connect with others and connect with others who are going through this or have been through this, so that you've got that outlet to talk. That is the main thing. I think I hear from so many people who have literally been through this, and it's been just themselves and their partner, and they've not told anyone else. And so reaching out for support from others. And there are some amazing, even just through social media. I mean, Instagram has got the most amazing network. If you search some hashtags like hashtag TTC, trying to conceive community, or hashtag IVF, you will find other people. And some people share anonymously, but they have an outlet to connect with other people who are going through this. And I think that connection part is really important. I also think one of the things I learned from my own journey and my own experience is it's really important to not let this consume you, because it can be all consuming. You can, especially when it comes to you thinking about your diet, you're thinking about, I mean, I must have spent so much money on acupuncture, reflexology, all of these other holistic treatments that might help, and you do become quite obsessive. And I think it's really important to hold on to those things that bring you joy and that make you you. I think it's really important to. Somebody mentioned a quote once, and it really stuck with me. It was, "Don't let trying stop you from living." And I very much put everything else on hold, social things, and that I wasn't trying not to drink so much, and I was doing. And actually, what I really needed was to have some outlets where I could be me again and not just the person who was going through IVF. And I think that's really important as well, to find there's lots of people out there who are supporting mindset around this. I think thinking about, can you do some meditation, some journaling each day, um, just to keep you sane, just to allow you to focus on you. And we just had someone say in the comments that nurturing your relationship with your partner, if you have one. And yeah, there's a huge I can't remember the statistic, but there's a huge number of relationships that break down whilst going through this, and it can be really difficult. And I remember myself and my partner, we were talking, and I think I did become very obsessive, and he would say to me, "Look, can we talk about something else, not just this?" And so we created our own special time to go and talk about this, and we'd go for a long walk, and that was a way of nurturing our relationship and making sure it wasn't all about this that we were going through, the fertility treatment, but it was about, like, as Fabienne has said, it's about being strong as a team. And yeah, and I think also recognizing that if you do have a partner, they are also going through this as well.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes it's very easy for the focus to always be on the woman. I know from speaking with other men and my own husband that they've often felt on the sideline and they've ignored in fertility appointments and everything else. And actually, for them, their role really is to be the supportive, strong one, when actually it's really difficult for them as well.
Yeah, 100%. And it is hard as well. And I'm going to correct me if I'm wrong. I do want to bring this up because you do see it, as you said, like if you can change that mindset to say live life still, and you hear these stories of people who've stopped IVS, who then kind of taken that mindset away from it all, then they hear, then they have then they conceive that child or conceive. Do you think that plays a role in it too, or is that just like it's just a number that happens?
Yeah, I think it's I think there is there's a percentage, and I can't remember off the top of my head what it is. So people who after IVF will then go on to conceive, and that can happen. I think it can be a really difficult one for people who are still in the midst of it to keep in mind, because the difficult thing is you're always thinking, is it something I'm doing? Is it my fault? And because you can't control what's happening, and I think that's the other thing, that there's a real lack of control over this. It's very much left down to nature and your body and everything else. You want to try and control everything. And so I think there are stories where people go and they finish treatment and they move on, they make a decision that, right, okay, that I've decided to stop. I hate the phrase give up, because I think there is a point for everyone where they might make that decision to stop. Um, and then it happens, but I think it's really difficult for people, because some people will hold on to that hope. And is it because I'm thinking about it too much? Is it because I'm stressed? Is it because of all these other things? And so, although that can happen, I think those stories again where people are struggling and then somebody says, "Oh, I know somebody who did this," then they
Yeah,
stopped and they stopped thinking about it, and then it happened. It can be really difficult, but it does happen. It can happen. And I know for some people who've had a child through IVF and then they've gone on to conceive naturally for their future child. So
yeah,
it's just, I think one thing that's really important to remember with this is everybody is different and every journey is different. And then I think another point I would make in terms of looking after yourself is comparison can be really, really damaging.
yeah,
And that's the same with anything in life, but particularly with this, you're comparing, you're hearing, oh, so and so got this many eggs at egg collection, I only got this many, and this.
yeah.
No two IVF cycles are the same, no two people are the same. And so you've almost got to stay in your lane and focus on what's right for you,
Yeah.
and where you are at that time.
The pros and cons of social media, that is. Use social media to
Yeah.
find the positives, but the comparison culture is so hard to ignore. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, no, thank you.
Yes.
I know we need a hard stop, don't we, in a couple of minutes. I have one question, then we'll get into top take homes. So keep it short. Is there a different approach for large companies versus small companies when it comes to supporting employees?
So what we're seeing is a lot of the companies we're working with are larger companies at the moment who are kind of leading that way, and mainly because they've got D&I budgets and wellbeing budgets, they've got departments and that focus on this. Um, but it doesn't mean that small organisations can't also make these changes. And I think it's really important. Quite often, what we do see, particularly from smaller organisations, is somebody with lived experience takes that role on,
Yeah,
and they decide that I want to make a difference. They start by sharing their story. They maybe create a little intranet page with some support resources, and that's where it starts. We're actually creating a package for smaller organisations
mhm,
where we can give that guidance around policy. We can share some training and information that they can do it as well, because we don't want it to be just
yeah,
something that large organisations do. And actually, SMEs make up a huge proportion of our workforce,
yeah.
and so this is very much a conversation that we want to be having with everyone, and that's the reason why we do a lot of our free lunch and learns as well. If there's somebody who wants to come and learn from what they can take back to their own business and make that difference, it can be those simple little changes. If there's somebody to talk about it, thinking about your flexible working policy, um, making sure that anything you have written down around this, whether it be in a handbook or if somebody comes to you, that you're aware and you're able to show them that empathy, but also to give them that support as well.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you. So normally I would just ask one question in regards to the top tips, but I feel like there's two parts to this, and whether it's give me as many up to three tips on each section. So, uh, Becky, what are your top take-home tips for a business to support their employees?
Okay, so keeping this succinct and brief, because I've spoken about this before, but it would be have some element of policy or guidance in place. not only for your employees, but for your managers as well. The second thing would be flexibility is really, really key for somebody who's going through this life event. And thirdly, it would be to treat everybody who comes to you with this with empathy, respect, and confidentiality as well. And I think it's really, really important that that confidentiality is a big part. We talk about opening up conversations, but that can be on a one-on-one level. It's about showing that empathy, and that can come through the written policy, but it can come through around the conversations that you're having within the workplace as well.
Great, love those, written them down. I think they're very useful points for business. Next question, top 3 take homes for an individual to support themselves in this situation.
Okay, so for an individual, I would say, how can your workplace support you if they don't know? And this is quite a big thing when people are thinking about, do I tell or not? There are ways in which you can raise this conversation, because often it's quite an emotional one. You may be feeling really wobbly and emotional. So we offer some tips on how to speak to your manager, or whether it's your HR department, find somebody you feel comfortable to speak to. But take resources with you. So we have a resource around what's included in IVF, and just go armed, take notes, go in with, and also go in with solutions, I would say as well, as to what would work for you, but what would also work for the business. So it's a two-way conversation around, I'm going to need this time for flexibility for this, but I can work around this, or I've got an idea as to how this might work. Because then what you're going in with, you're not just asking for, you're showing them how this could work. And so it's thinking about how you broach that conversation, would be my advice. And also just look after yourself. I would say be aware that, I remember one of the biggest things I felt when I was going through this was I used to beat myself up, because I felt like I was overreacting, or that maybe this was just me not being able to cope. And actually recognizing that you're going through what is a significant life event for many people, recognizing that grief, and seeking that support if you need it. It's not weak to ask for help. Counseling can be really, really helpful as well. So yeah, I think there's probably more
Well,
than 3 in there, but that would be my advice.
yeah, 100%. And I think I was going to reiterate that last piece. I was going to say it if you hadn't. I think looking after yourself, understanding what positive health and well-being is for you, and then trying to lead that life on top of what you're trying to go through, because that's only going to impact your journey in a positive way.
Yeah,
Agree?
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, we can't control a lot of the outcomes, but we can control what we're doing for ourselves. Yeah.
Thank you, Becky. You've been a superstar. Fabienne, I think I don't know if I'm butchering that or not. Being dyslexic, I read as it is. Thank you for commenting and joining us, and actually adding some really valuable questions and input. Really appreciate that. We have another podcast lined up for a couple of weeks' time with a lady called Maria, who has won a HR award. So we'll find out what she's done to do that, how she achieved that, and what a good workplace looks like. But in the meantime, thank you, Becky, for joining me. Thanks for giving us such really great information and advice around this topic. I hope lots of people can use it. Obviously, they can come back and find you at Becky Kearns on LinkedIn, or Fertility Matters, and use Fertility Matters as a really great resource, as you said all the way through. So thank you for coming and sharing and being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for having this conversation.
No problem. See you all soon, guys. Bye-bye.